Let's turn our attention now to the BNP, who polled 5.7% of the votes in the general election in May. Their candidate is Derek Adams, and as with the others, my first question to Mr. Adams was for his reaction to the news that legal challenges were to be raised by Elwyn Watkins against the results that saw Phil Wallace win in the general election.
Well, when I heard that it was about politicians telling lies, it rather surprised me, but there you go.
In so much as that's what normally happens, you mean?
Well, in my experience, and going back over the last sort of 60 years, I can't think of many politicians that have told the truth, with perhaps the exception of Enoch Powell, and he was virtually chucked out of Westminster for it, wasn't he?
So if Mr. Watkins were to accept that it was the rough and tumble of politics, was it the actions of a sore loser? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would have thought so. I mean, what Mr. Watkins ought to try and do is stand in for the British National Party now and again, because although they don't tell lies about us directly, they get front groups such as Unite Against Fascism, Hope Not Hate, all these sort of front groups, and they're sponsored by David Cameron, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party. They're all sponsored by these groups are sponsored by them, and they go out putting out downright lies about the British National Party at every single election. So I've had to take it for years. I can't see why he didn't, but there you go.
Okay, let's move on to the constituents itself and the by-election. Clearly, we've had an election in the interim period. Spending cuts have been suggested by the coalition government and are beginning to bite. How will they affect the constituency, do you think?
Well, I've no doubt in my mind whatsoever, going off most councils that I've had experience with and what have you, these spending cuts are going to affect the worst, the most needy in society. There's no two ways about it. My suggestion would be that rather than cutting back on things like service for old age pensioners, etc., should we not be cutting back on things like foreign aid? Oldham Council, for instance, spends an absolute fortune printing leaflets in several different languages, providing interpretation services. I mean, my pull on that would be, if someone doesn't really want to speak English, then pay for your own translation service. As simple as that.
Well, not everybody is in a position to do that, and if constituents are resident in Oldham East and Saddleworth and are entitled to services, they're entitled to understand the services they can receive.
Well, by the same rule, I mean, there are people in Oldham that have been here for sort of 30, 40 years and never bothered to even try and learn English, so my stake on that again would be, if you really don't want to learn English, then pay for your own interpreter. I've no problem the council providing an interpreter, but they should be charging for it if that's really needed.
But not everybody is in a position to pay for that, are they?
Well, if they're not in a position to pay for it, then they want to use a bit of the spare time. I mean, they're supposed to be migrant workers. Let's try and use a bit of the spare time that they've got because they're unemployed on brushing up on their English. That might be a good idea, mightn't it?
Okay, that's one suggestion for where you might make some savings. What do you think the cuts are? How do you think the cuts are actually affecting the constituents as we approach the by-election? I mean, is it? Well, you tell me. What do you think is the most direct effect to the constituents in terms of the cuts?
Well, obviously, I mean, the council have been they're going to have to start making job cuts, etc. But as I say, knowing what most of the left-wing councils are like, the only place they're going to make job cuts is in frontline services, as opposed to the politically correct sort of projects that they have ongoing. They're not going to cut on any of them, I'll guarantee you.
They're not going to cut the politically correct services?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. It's very unusual if they did.
They're going to cut the collection of bins and the provision of road lighting ahead of translation services?
I would have thought so. Knowing councils like Oldham, yes.
And that clearly isn't a policy that you would pursue.
Definitely not.
How would you promote economic growth in Oldham East and Saddleworth? Because it's clearly something that needs to be done. I mean, it needs to be done for the community and as a whole, the country as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what about the constituency that you choose to represent, Mr. Adams? How would you promote economic growth there?
Well, for a start, I'd campaign for the banks. The greedy banks that we in effect own, I mean, they were virtually nationalised with public money, so it's about time they paid something back, and I would try and force the banks to provide low interest loans to start up businesses in the Oldham area, but but not just any old start-up business, because you know everyone will jump on the bandwagon. What we need is start-up businesses that restore proper industry to this country, as in engineering, manufacturing. I mean, the country's been in a massive decline, and Oldham especially, and there's an awful lot of manufacturing base. We've got no skills left. That's why people are unemployed. They've got no skills, and at the end of the day, are we going to train a nation to flip burgers at somewhere like McDonald's? I wouldn't have thought that was a good idea.
Training programmes would be welcomed. Apprenticeships might be the way forward.
It's the way forward.
How do we fund those at a time of economic austerity?
As I say, we just said, I mean,
you can't fund an entire apprenticeship programme by cutting translation services. Where else might you have to make savings?
Well, for a start, I mean, the foreign aid budget is one that really shouldn't. I mean, we've got all three parties saying that we need to spend foreign aid, and I would say, well, we've got pensioners freezing to death in the winter, people that have paid in all their life. Why on earth are we spending money and sending money away to places like India, who are funding, rocket programs with it, etc.? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that the foreign aid budget is spent on rocket programs.
Well, it might not be spent on that, but we're
in need.
India have just spent an absolute fortune on a rocket program, and we're still sending them foreign aid, which is totally wrong. Their government, it's not up to us to make their government have the right priorities, is it?
So you would cut the entire foreign aid budget?
Absolutely. Charity should begin at home. It's as simple as that. And at the end of the day, if we've still got, and we have got a problem with ex-servicemen can't get housing when they come out of the service, sleeping on the streets. We've got pensioners dying of cold in the winter. Why on earth are we spending one single penny on someone else's country?
Which brings me to the issue of the diverse community in Oldham East and Saddleworth. There's been immigration from Eastern Europe there. There's been immigration from farther afield. How do you think it's affected those who live and work in the constituency?
Well, obviously it's affected people that live and work there, because, I mean, in so many ways it's untrue. I mean, regardless of what anyone tells you, the so-called migrant worker was never needed in this country, and I don't care what anyone says about that. They were never needed. At the end of the day, we were lied to about it sort of 50, 60 years ago when this programme started. We were told at the time that we needed these people because we didn't want to do dirty jobs.
That still applies.
Well, no,
find people who won't do the jobs, and
not at all. Listen, you're talking here about a country that's given pretty much 50% of the inventions to the world. We went through the Second World War with half the men away serving in the forces, fighting to keep this country free from foreign occupation. All those men that were away during the war, and this country still kept its head above water. It provided munitions, it provided armaments, etc. with the men away from the country. They came back from the war. They were told they'd come back to a land that was fit for heroes, and unfortunately it wasn't, because we started then bringing in cheap labour to do away with the jobs that they were doing. The only reason the cheap labour was brought in was because people were demanding real wages for doing proper jobs. It's as simple as that. I mean, the second lie we were told was years later, when the first lie was wearing thin. We didn't want to do the dirty jobs. Try telling that to coal miners. Try telling that to the sewage workers at the time. They wanted to do the jobs. Unfortunately, they weren't being paid the going rate to do them, and that was exactly what it was all about. The next lie, of course, came a few years later, when that one wore a little bit thin, and then they started saying, well, you're too lazy now to do the jobs. Well, that was never the case before. This is a home of the Industrial Revolution, and of course, when that lie wore even thinner, then they started calling us, just recently, they're calling us too stupid to do the jobs, and we need skills from abroad, which again is a load of rubbish, because if we need skills from abroad, why don't we train our own doctors and nurses like we used to do?
Derek Adams, who is representing the BNP at the Oldham East and Saddleworth by-election, and so